A struggling young student made an unexpected decision. He married a 71-year-old wealthy woman. Just 1 week later, he found himself staring at a gray sky that hung heavily over the small college town in Texas. The rain poured steadily, drenching the streets and creating glistening puddles on the asphalt. The dismal weather seemed to echo the turmoil building within him as he grappled with the consequences of his choices. Mark Davis trudged through the rain-soaked streets, his battered sneakers splashing through shallow puddles. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, the weight of its contents nothing compared to the burdens that lined his furrowed brow. Each step was heavy with the weight of his worries. At just 23 years old, Mark was navigating a relentless storm of responsibilities. His final year of law school demanded every ounce of his focus. His part-time job barely scraped together enough for daily necessities, and a mountain of debts left by his late father loomed over him like an unyielding shadow. The weight of it all threatened to crush him. Each passing day felt like the walls of his world were shrinking, pressing in from all sides. The oppressive pressure of deadlines, bills, and unfulfilled dreams left him feeling suffocated, as though the ground beneath his feet could crumble at any moment. The sudden vibration of his phone in his pocket jolted him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was a small, abrupt interruption in the endless loop of worry that occupied his mind. Raising the phone to his ear, he spoke with an automatic politeness. "Mark Davis speaking," he said, his tone clipped and weary. On the other end of the line, a calm yet commanding voice cut through the background noise of falling rain. It was the kind of voice that demanded attention without raising itself. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks," the voice continued, her tone calm yet commanding. "I would like to arrange a meeting with you," she stated, each word deliberate and precise. "It concerns your current financial situation," she added, her words hanging in the air with weight. Mark's brows knitted together in confusion, a frown spreading across his. "I'm sorry. Who are you? And how do you know about—" he began, his tone a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "I know enough," she cut him off, her voice smooth and firm. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." Before he could form a reply or protest, the call abruptly ended, leaving him staring at his phone in stunned silence. Confusion and a twinge of curiosity gnawed at him as the hours passed. Eventually, with no other option, he found himself heading toward the upscale cafe named in the call. By the time he reached the cafe, the rain had intensified, drenching his thin jacket, which offered little protection against the downpour. As he pushed open the door, a wave of warmth enveloped him, accompanied by the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. In a quiet corner of the cafe, Eleanor Brooks sat poised. Her silver hair was styled with meticulous care, and her tailored suit exuded sophistication and unmistakable wealth. She was an imposing presence, commanding attention without effort. "Mark," she said in a calm, measured tone, gesturing gracefully for him to take the seat opposite her. Her voice was steady, laced with an authority that was impossible to ignore, even in such a casual setting. Mark hesitated, the weight of uncertainty pressing on him, before cautiously lowering himself into the chair across from her. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, his voice tinged with both curiosity and wariness. "What's this all about?" "Straight to the point. I like that," she remarked approvingly before taking a deliberate sip of her tea. "Mark, I'm aware of the debts your father left you with," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I know you're struggling to make ends meet. I've come to offer you a solution." Mark's expression darkened, his brow knitting in confusion. "And what exactly would that be?" he asked, his tone edged with suspicion. She carefully set her cup down, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Marry me," she said, the words delivered with startling directness. The shocking proposal hung in the air between them, the weight of it almost tangible. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief as he blinked rapidly. "Excuse me," he stammered, convinced he'd misheard her. "You heard me correctly," she said, her voice remaining steady and composed. "This isn't about love or romance. It's a business proposition. I'll clear all your debts and guarantee your financial security. In exchange, you will become my husband." Mark let out a hollow, incredulous laugh. "You're serious?" he said, shaking his head. Why me? You don't even know me. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her gaze unyielding. Precisely. You're young, single, and desperate enough to entertain this idea. I'm not looking for love, Mark. I need a partner, someone to share my name and estate. Nothing more. Treat it like any other contract. Mark shook his head in disbelief, his thoughts racing. This is crazy. What's in it for you? He demanded, his voice rising slightly. For the first time, her expression softened, a hint of vulnerability seeping through her composed exterior. I've lived my life in solitude, Mark. No children, no remaining family. I want companionship, even if it's only for appearances. Beyond that, I need to secure my legacy, and having a husband will solidify that. Mark pushed his chair back with a sudden scrape, rising to his feet. I can't. I need time to think, he said, his voice a mix of frustration and bewilderment. Naturally, she responded with an air of calm indifference. But don't wait too long. This offer isn't indefinite. Mark walked home, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of confusion, the rain soaking through his already damp jacket and clinging to his skin in cold discomfort. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the difficult conversation he'd just endured pressed down on him with increasing force. Later that evening, Mark sat in silence at the small, familiar kitchen table, his gaze fixed on his mother. Her face, pale and etched with worry, seemed to reflect the unspoken tension filling the space, a heaviness that neither of them could escape. The escalating expenses of his mother's medical treatments had drained their finances to the breaking point. As if that weren't enough, the impending cost of his younger sister's college tuition loomed on the horizon like a gathering storm, threatening to overwhelm them in ways they weren't prepared to handle. Mark, his mother said softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty as she absorbed the weight of Eleanor's startling proposal. I know this may seem impossible to believe, but if what she's offering is genuine, perhaps you owe it to yourself and to us to at least think about it seriously. Mark's gaze fell to his hands, fingers tightly intertwined as though to hold himself together. He felt trapped in an excruciating internal battle, torn between the fierce grip of his pride and the relentless, gnawing desperation threatening to consume him. So, what you're telling me is that I should marry someone I don't care about, someone I hardly even know, just to solve all our problems? He asked, his voice cracking with disbelief and a simmering undercurrent of resentment. I'm asking you to survive, Mark, his mother answered, her voice shaking with emotion. To find a way to protect yourself, and through that, to protect us as well. The following morning, after spending a sleepless night wrestling with his thoughts and weighing every possible outcome, Mark found himself once again standing outside the familiar doors of Brooks Bistro. Inside, Eleanor sat in her usual spot at the corner table, her calm and composed demeanor entirely unshaken, as if she had known all along that he would return. Without lifting her gaze from the sleek tablet she was casually scrolling through, she asked in a composed, almost indifferent tone, "Have you decided yet?" Mark took a deep, steadying breath, summoning every ounce of courage he could muster. "I'll do it," he said resolutely, though the erratic pounding of his heart betrayed the storm of emotion within him. A faint, calculated smile appeared on her lips as she set the tablet down with deliberate precision. "Good," she said smoothly. "I'll begin making all the necessary arrangements immediately," her tone remaining cool and controlled. Exactly 1 week later, Mark found himself standing awkwardly in a modest courthouse, dressed in a tailored suit that Eleanor had selected and paid for without consulting him, its fine fabric feeling strangely out of place against his unease. The ceremony was short and devoid of any celebration, attended only by Eleanor's impassive lawyer and a notary, who quietly oversaw their exchange of vows. The room's hollow atmosphere was formal, yet it carried a weight that felt strangely stifling. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, an unsettling heaviness enveloped Mark's chest. The words echoed in his mind, feeling less like a declaration of union and more like the sealing of a binding contract. Eleanor turned to face him, her lips curving into a precise but detached smile, devoid of any warmth or sincerity, as though it were rehearsed rather than heartfelt. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said with practiced smoothness, her voice carrying an icy undertone that sent an involuntary shiver down Mark's spine. Exactly 1 week later, Mark found himself standing uncomfortably in a modest courthouse, clad in an elegant, expensive suit that Eleanor had meticulously selected and paid for, a garment that seemed to fit him physically, but felt foreign in every other way. The ceremony was strikingly brief, devoid of any sense of celebration or joy, attended only by Eleanor's stoic lawyer and an impassive notary. The room felt devoid of life, its sterile formality lending a strangely oppressive weight to the proceedings. When the officiant solemnly pronounced them husband and wife, Mark felt a deep and unsettling heaviness settle over his chest. The words echoed in his mind, resonating more as the finalization of a binding legal agreement than the joyful culmination of a heartfelt union. Eleanor turned to face him, her lips forming a polite, almost mechanical smile, a gesture so devoid of warmth that it felt carefully rehearsed, rather than the natural expression of emotion. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said, with a practiced smoothness, her tone calm yet edged with an unsettling sharpness that sent an involuntary shiver down Mark's spine. As they stepped out into the gray drizzle, Mark's gaze was drawn downward, catching his reflection in a shallow, murky puddle on the uneven ground. His thoughts swirled in turmoil as he stared into his own weary face. "Have I truly saved my family from ruin?" he questioned grimly. "Or have I paid for their survival with my own soul?" The massive wrought iron gates of Eleanor Brooks's estate groaned and creaked ominously as they slowly swung open, granting the cab carrying Mark entry to the vast property. The driveway stretched before him, winding endlessly through meticulously landscaped grounds that seemed designed to intimidate as much as impress. As the house came into view, its sheer size and pristine upkeep struck Mark like a wave. The sprawling mansion, with its immaculate design and grandeur, resembled a grand museum more than a place of residence. Its immense scale and imposing elegance both awed and overwhelmed him. Towering Grecian columns framed the front of the mansion, their imposing presence complemented by the flawless stone facade, exuding an air of wealth and historical significance. Yet, the darkened windows gave the estate an unsettlingly cold, lifeless feel, as if it were a relic untouched by time or human presence. Mark climbed out of the cab, clutching his modest suitcase. The surreal grandeur of the estate made him feel like an uninvited guest in someone else's elaborate dream. Or perhaps, he thought grimly, into the depths of a carefully constructed nightmare. Eleanor met him at the grand foyer, her every movement exuding an air of practiced refinement. Her demeanor was as flawlessly composed as ever, betraying no hint of emotion or imperfection. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," she said smoothly, her voice carrying a formal tone that was both detached and unnerving, the cold professionalism of her words sending an involuntary shiver coursing down Mark's spine. "I trust you'll find your accommodations more than satisfactory," she continued, her tone calm but distant, as though issuing an order rather than extending hospitality. "Dinner will be served promptly at 7, she added, her words carrying an unspoken command. Mark nodded wordlessly, unsure of what to say. He fell into step behind a silent housekeeper, who gestured for him to follow as she guided him up the winding staircase to his assigned quarters. The room was a display of overwhelming opulence, featuring a grand king-sized bed adorned with rich, luxurious linens. Antique furnishings filled the space, each piece appearing more suited to a museum than a residence. Towering floor-to-ceiling windows offered a pristine view of the flawlessly manicured gardens below, their symmetry and beauty almost surreal. Despite the overwhelming luxury, there was a distinct chill in the air, a coldness that suggested the room had seen little genuine human presence. That evening, Mark found himself seated at an absurdly long dining table, his posture rigid as the weight of the day pressed on him. Eleanor sat at the far end, dressed with her usual perfection in a silk blouse and a delicate string of pearls, her expression unreadable. The meal was an extravagant affair, each dish expertly crafted by a chef who remained unseen. Silent staff glided around the room, delivering the courses with mechanical precision. "I trust you're adjusting well," Eleanor said, her voice casual yet firm as she methodically sliced into her filet mignon with the precision of a surgeon. "It's different," Mark replied hesitantly. "This house is enormous. I feel like I might get lost just walking to the bathroom." "This place is enormous," Mark said, glancing around with a hint of unease. "I feel like I'm going to need a map just to find my way around." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smirk, her expression almost mocking. "You'll either get used to it over time," she said, her tone carrying a hint of indifference. Her voice dropped, taking on an ominous edge. "As you might guess, not all of those meetings ended well. Or you won't. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that this is where you belong now." Mark stiffened at her blunt response, irritation sparking in his chest. "You haven't really talked much about your late husband," he said, steering the conversation away from himself with a deliberate tone. Eleanor's knife stopped abruptly, hovering over her plate as though frozen by the sudden shift in topic. After a deliberate moment, she picked up her napkin and dabbed her mouth with measured precision before finally responding. "He was involved in business, much like your father," she said evenly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Their paths happened to cross once or twice over the years." Her tone shifted, growing heavier and laced with a subtle ominousness. "But, as you can probably imagine, not every encounter ends on good terms," she added cryptically. Mark's heart began to race, a knot of unease forming in his chest. "What exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his voice tinged with urgency. She fixed him with a piercing gaze, her sharp blue eyes seeming to see through him. "Let's just say that unfinished business," she said slowly, her voice dropping to a chilling tone, "has a way of lingering far longer than it should." Eleanor lifted her glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine before speaking again, her voice carrying a cryptic tone. "But all of that is ancient history now," she said, her words carefully measured. "In time, you'll come to understand exactly why I made the choice to bring you here." Her ambiguous, layered words hung in the air, their meaning elusive but heavy with implication. They left Mark with a deep and growing unease that clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. That night, unable to sleep, Mark roamed aimlessly through the sprawling, seemingly endless halls of the estate. Each step he took echoed faintly, the sound amplified by the pristine, polished floors and the suffocating silence surrounding him. The oppressive silence of the house seemed almost unnatural, broken only by the occasional creak or groan of the aged floorboards beneath his tentative steps, a sound that only added to the eerie atmosphere. As he wandered, his path took him past an endless series of doors, each one tightly secured. Their ornate brass handles gleamed faintly in the dim, flickering light of the corridor, an ominous contrast to the oppressive stillness of the house. Each locked door exuded an almost tangible sense of mystery, as if they were guardians of secrets so deep and dark that he was neither meant to know them nor entitled to their truths. In the days that followed, Mark's feeling of unease grew heavier, gnawing at his resolve. The weight of his decision hung over him like an invisible burden, pressing down on his every thought and action. The estate's staff seemed to go out of their way to avoid looking directly at him, their hurried footsteps quickening and their whispered conversations ceasing entirely whenever he approached. Occasionally, Mark overheard brief, disjointed fragments of hushed exchanges, their vague but unsettling content sending cold shivers coursing down his spine. "Why him?" Mark heard one voice murmur in a tone heavy with concern. "Does he even realize what's happening? She always has her reasons." Another voice replied softly, the words spoken with an air of grim resignation, as if referencing an unspoken but immutable truth. "He'll understand eventually." A third voice added in a barely audible whisper. "They always do in the end." The ominous words lingering in Mark's mind like an unwelcome echo. One particularly restless evening, Mark found himself pacing the vast expanse of the Grand Library. The towering shelves filled with dusty tomes and artifacts offered no solace or distraction from the storm of troubled thoughts consuming his mind. As his restless pacing continued, his gaze was drawn to Eleanor's desk, a dominant centerpiece in the room, its surface cluttered yet exuding a sense of deliberate order and purpose. The desk was littered with neatly arranged stacks of papers and documents, but Mark's attention was immediately captured by a small, ornate key that lay conspicuously in plain view, its intricate engravings glinting faintly in the lamp's soft glow. The key seemed to almost glow under the gentle light of the desk lamp, its finely detailed engravings catching the light and holding Mark's attention like an unyielding magnet. Mark's eyes darted nervously around the library, scanning for any signs of movement, any hint of Eleanor or the staff. But the room was utterly still, the air heavy with silence. Mark's pulse raced as he slowly extended his hand toward the key, his fingers hovering above it for a moment of hesitation, before finally closing around its cool, smooth surface. The key felt surprisingly weighty in his grip, its cool, polished surface pressing firmly against his palm. It carried a gravity that seemed to go beyond its physical form, as if imbued with a deeper significance. Mark's thoughts spiraled furiously, leaping to the possibility that this small, unassuming object might be the key, quite literally, to the locked doors he had passed repeatedly in the dim, silent corridors. Mark cast a quick, cautious glance toward the shadowed hallway just beyond the library, the flickering light of the sconces casting moving, ghost-like patterns across the walls. His breath came faster, shallower, as he carefully slid the key into his pocket. The small object's weight seemed to increase tenfold, pressing against his thigh like a brand, as though it carried with it an undeniable warning. Later that night, as he lay awake in the sprawling, opulent emptiness of his cold, impersonal room, Mark held the key tightly in his hands, turning it over repeatedly. The rough etching on its surface pressed into his fingertips, grounding his thoughts as they swirled chaotically. Mark's mind raced with questions, each more pressing than the last, swirling in a storm of uncertainty. Yet, one thought emerged above the rest, clear and insistent, demanding to be addressed. What hidden truths was Eleanor concealing behind those heavily locked and forbidding doors? And, perhaps most disturbingly, why had Eleanor gone to such elaborate and deliberate lengths to involve him in this bizarre and deeply unsettling arrangement? The estate was enshrouded in an eerie, almost unnatural stillness as Mark stepped cautiously into the corridor. The silence seemed to close in on him, pressing against his chest like an invisible but undeniable weight. The key resting in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with every step he took, its smooth, cool surface pressing against his thigh, like a tangible reminder of the bold and potentially reckless act he was about to undertake. His heartbeat pounded relentlessly in his ears, each thud growing louder as he approached one of the locked doors. The ornate handle, adorned with intricate patterns, glimmered faintly under the dim, flickering light of the corridor. Earlier that day, Mark had paused to notice the door's detailed craftsmanship. The intricate brass handle had gleamed softly, illuminated by the pale, silvery glow of moonlight that filtered through the tall windows nearby. Mark cast a cautious, wary glance over his shoulder, his senses heightened by the oppressive stillness of the house. With trembling fingers, he slid the key carefully into the lock, turning it agonizingly slowly until the faint, deliberate click reverberated through the suffocating silence. The sound of the lock disengaging sent a shiver racing up his spine, as though the house itself were holding its breath. With painstaking caution, Mark pushed the door open, his movements deliberate and slow. The soft creak of the hinges cut through the oppressive silence like a faint, mournful protest. The room that unfolded before him felt like a frozen moment from a long-forgotten era, its every detail preserved in a way that suggested it had remained untouched by the passage of time. Dust blanketed the aged furniture, and the once vivid wallpaper now appeared dull and faded. The room exuded an air of abandonment, its atmosphere thick with the weight of memories left behind. Against one wall stood a table adorned with an array of photographs, each encased in tarnished silver frames. They displayed scenes of joy and connection, frozen glimpses of a happier, simpler time long since past. In one frame, a younger Eleanor stood beaming, her carefree smile and radiant expression capturing a time of happiness. Beside her was a man Mark presumed to be her late husband. Another photograph featured a couple he didn't recognize, their warm smiles speaking of a bond he could only guess at. What ultimately captured Mark's attention was a disorganized stack of yellowed papers on the desk, their edges curled and aged. They seemed to call to him with an unspoken urgency, demanding his attention. Mark hesitated before picking up the stack, his fingers trembling slightly as he began to thumb through the pages. With every sentence he read, his eyes widened in shock and disbelief. The contents of the documents painted a grim picture, outlining a string of failed business ventures between Eleanor's late husband and Mark's father. Each page seemed to deepen the troubling connection between their families. Among the pile, a letter written in sharp, slanted handwriting immediately drew his eye. Its tone was biting and accusatory, laying the blame for financial ruin squarely on Mark's father and accusing him of fraud and betrayal. The words scrawled across the page read, "You destroyed everything. Your lies left my family destitute." Mark's breath hitched as he turned to the final page, his heart sinking. The contents sent a wave of nausea rolling through him, the implications more devastating than he had imagined. Sitting at the bottom of the stack was a marriage license, its bold official lettering unmistakable. Mark's name and Eleanor's stood out starkly, already signed and dated, leaving no room for doubt or denial. The date on the license made his blood run cold. It had been issued weeks before Eleanor had even come to him with her proposal. The premeditated nature of her actions was now painfully clear. Resting beside the papers was an old, leather-bound diary, its edges frayed from years of use. Mark hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling slightly, before he flipped open the diary's worn cover. Inside, Eleanor's detailed entries painted a picture of her meticulous planning. Her ultimate goal became clear: to ensnare Mark in a marriage designed to exact revenge for past grievances. One line burned itself into his memory: "I will strip him of everything, just as his father did to me. He will be my pawn." Mark's body stiffened as the sound of a door creaking open echoed behind him, cutting through the suffocating stillness of the room. "Finding anything interesting?" Eleanor's voice, icy and sharp, sliced through the oppressive silence like a blade. Mark spun around to face her, guilt and fear mingling in his wide-eyed expression. "Eleanor, he stammered, his voice faltering under the weight of her piercing gaze. "You assumed you'd find all the answers in here," she said, stepping further into the room, her voice low and mocking. Eleanor stepped fully into the room, her silhouette stark against the dim light spilling in from the corridor. "Curiosity is dangerous, Mark. What exactly do you think you're doing?" she asked, her tone both condescending and threatening. "Why did you really marry me?" Mark demanded, his voice trembling but firm. "Is this about my father? Are you trying to get revenge?" Eleanor's gaze turned steely, her composed mask slipping just enough to reveal the fury simmering beneath. "It's not your place to ask such questions, Mark," she snapped. "Do as you're told, and you'll walk away from this marriage in a better position than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" Mark's hands balled into fists at his sides. "Enough? You've lied to me, manipulated me. This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." He shot back, his voice rising in defiance. A faint, cold smile curved Eleanor's lips, but it never touched her eyes, which remained calculating and hard. "A trap?" she echoed mockingly. "Perhaps you should have considered that before you signed those documents." Stepping closer, she lowered her voice to a venomous hiss. "You think you're clever, Mark, but you're just like your father, blind to the harm you cause until it's far too late." Mark glared at her, his chest tightening under the crushing weight of his father's tarnished legacy. "If you despised him that much, why are you taking it out on me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "I had nothing to do with what he did to your family." Eleanor's piercing gaze remained fixed on him, the silence between them stretching until it felt unbearable, taut like a string ready to snap. At last, she turned sharply on her heel. "You're in way over your head, Mark. "Leave things alone that don't concern you," she said coldly, her tone brooking no argument. Without offering him the chance to reply, she turned sharply on her heel and strode out of the room with purposeful strides. Her echoing footsteps faded gradually, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to fill the hallway like a heavy fog. That night, Mark lay rigidly in the grand, oversized bed that seemed to offer comfort only in appearance. His eyes remained wide open, staring at the ornate ceiling as his thoughts spiraled uncontrollably, each one more troubling than the last. Eleanor's cold, unsettling words echoed endlessly in his mind, their implications impossible to ignore. Yet it was the damning revelations contained in the documents and diary that haunted him most, casting a dark shadow over his every thought. Why had Eleanor gone to such extraordinary lengths to trap him in her scheme? What deeper motive lay behind her intricate web of manipulation? What could she possibly be after? Could a desire for revenge alone truly explain the intricate web of lies, deceit, and control that she had so meticulously constructed? His tumultuous train of thought was abruptly derailed by a faint noise, Eleanor's voice, unmistakable in its commanding tone, cutting through the stillness and drifting from the direction of her study. Moving as quietly as possible, Mark slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the dimly lit hallway, his movements careful and deliberate. He stopped just outside her study, pressing his ear against the heavy door as he strained to catch the muffled words within. "Make sure the transfer is completed without delay," Eleanor's voice commanded, sharp and laced with a tone of absolute authority. "We can't risk him changing his mind now," she continued, her voice tense and underscored by urgency. "The clock is ticking, and we're running out of time." A wave of cold dread surged through Mark's veins, rooting him to the spot as the gravity of her words settled over him like an icy shroud. The implication struck him with a force that left him momentarily paralyzed. Whatever Eleanor was planning, it was becoming clear to Mark that it was far more complex and infinitely darker than anything he had previously dared to imagine. Mark found himself seated alone in the expansive library, the towering shelves of books surrounding him like silent witnesses. They offered no solace or clarity, as the whirlpool of fear and confusion in his mind grew stronger and more overwhelming. Eleanor's cryptic warnings echoed alongside the damning evidence he had uncovered in the hidden room. Together, they erased any doubt. Mark was ensnared in a situation that was far beyond his understanding or control. The estate, which had once stood as a grand symbol of immense wealth and influence, now felt suffocating, like an intricately designed prison. Its lavish exterior was nothing more than a fragile mask, concealing the dark and ominous secrets lurking within its walls. That evening, Mark sought out Mr. Harris, the estate's stoic head butler. There was something about the man's calm, almost detached demeanor that suggested he had seen far more than he let on. "Mr. Harris," Mark began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help. Something about this place, about her. It's not right." The older man turned to face Mark, his steady gaze betraying no emotion. His hands remained clasped behind his back, a gesture of measured restraint. "Mr. Harris, I wondered how long it would be before you sought me out," he said quietly, his words carrying an air of inevitability. "Mark, you know something," Mark pressed, his tone firm. "About Eleanor, about all of this, don't you?" Mr. Harris paused, his lips tightening as if weighing the consequences of his response. "You're not the first young man she's lured into her world, Mark. Eleanor is clever, relentless, and utterly ruthless when it comes to achieving her goals. My advice to you," he continued, leaning in slightly, "be vigilant. Watch your back." Mark's chest constricted with unease. "If you know what she's capable of, why are you still here?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and frustration. For the first time, Mr. Harris's composed expression softened, a shadow of regret flickering across his features. "Not all of us have the privilege to walk away, Mark," he said quietly, the weight of his words heavy with unspoken meaning. Resolving to take control of the situation, Mark began to formulate a plan, his mind racing to find a way out of Eleanor's web. Desperate for help, he reached out to Peter, a close friend from law school he knew he could trust. "Peter," Mark began cautiously over the phone. "Hypothetically speaking, if someone signed a contract under coercion or false pretenses, is there a legal way to nullify it?" Peter. "Hypothetically, yes, but it would depend heavily on the evidence. Why do you ask? Are you in some sort of trouble?" "It's for a class project," Mark lied quickly, his voice forced into casualness. "Thanks for the insight, man." Over the following days, Mark made calculated attempts to search Eleanor's office whenever she was out, determined to uncover the root of her obsession with his father. Late one evening, under the dim glow of a desk lamp, Mark stumbled upon an envelope marked with his father's name, hidden among Eleanor's meticulous papers. The envelope contained a scathing letter penned in Eleanor's unmistakable hand, each word dripping with anger and accusation. The letter detailed accusations of embezzlement, fraud, and deceit, painting a damning picture of Mark's father as the architect of Eleanor's family's financial downfall, and, by extension, the cause of her husband's untimely death. "You left my family with nothing," one line read. "My husband's heart couldn't bear the strain of what you did. He's gone because of you. I will see to it that your family pays for what you've done." A wave of nausea hit Mark as he read the damning words, the accusations hitting closer to home than he ever expected. It became chillingly clear that Eleanor's actions weren't solely about reclaiming wealth, they were a calculated pursuit of revenge, fueled by years of unrelenting pain and simmering anger. Mark carefully placed the letter back where he found it, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let Eleanor's vendetta continue unchecked. Determined, Mark vowed not to let himself be used as a pawn in Eleanor's dark scheme of vengeance. That night, seated at the edge of his bed, he sketched out potential escape routes from the estate, each plan clouded by uncertainty and risk. However, Eleanor's keen instincts quickly picked up on the subtle changes in Mark's behavior, her suspicions sharpening like a blade. The next morning, she appeared in the breakfast room without warning, her icy demeanor slicing through the room's uneasy stillness. "Eleanor, you've been keeping yourself quite occupied, haven't you?" she said, her tone a dangerous blend of curiosity and accusation. Mark froze mid-motion, his spoon hovering just inches from his mouth, his heart thudding in his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." Eleanor's lips curled into a frigid smile, her icy gaze locking onto Mark. "Don't waste my time with false innocence, Mark. If you think for a second you can outmaneuver me, you're sadly mistaken. I've faced far more cunning adversaries than you and left them regretting their choices." Mark swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing his voice into what he hoped sounded like a calm response. "I'm not sure what you're accusing me of, but I haven't done anything wrong," he said, though his wavering tone betrayed him. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that sent chills racing up Mark's spine. "Mark, if you ever betray me, I promise you'll regret it in ways you can't even imagine. Keep that in mind." Straightening her posture, Eleanor cast one last icy glance at Mark before sweeping out of the room. He was left sitting in a haze of dread, the realization sinking in that any attempt to escape might be far more perilous than remaining trapped in her schemes. Yet staying meant submitting to Eleanor's manipulative grip and forfeiting any chance at reclaiming his autonomy, a fate Mark knew he couldn't accept. The oppressive atmosphere of the estate seemed to close in as Mark paced the library restlessly. The weight of his recent discoveries bore down on him, the knowledge churning in his mind like a storm. Earlier that day, a private investigator Mark had secretly hired departed after delivering grim news that confirmed his worst fears. According to the investigator, Eleanor's late husband, Harold Brooks, had been a victim of a devastating real estate scam orchestrated by Mark's father. The scheme had obliterated the Brooks family's wealth, leaving them with nothing. Not long after the scandal, Harold had succumbed to a heart attack, a loss Eleanor blamed squarely on the stress caused by Mark's father's betrayal. The tragedy solidified her resolve to exact revenge, no matter the cost. The investigator explained that Eleanor's marriage proposal to Mark wasn't just a ploy, it was a carefully designed chess move in her campaign of retribution. Her plan extended far beyond mere financial recovery. It was a way to make Mark's family endure the suffering she believed they had inflicted on hers, even after death. Mark's hands curled into tight fists, his knuckles whitening as anger surged through him. How could she hold him accountable for sins that weren't his? Why should I be punished for my father's mistakes? He thought, his chest tightening with frustration and resentment. Yet beneath his frustration, a flicker of empathy stirred. He couldn't ignore the raw pain that had driven Eleanor to such extremes, years of anger, grief, and a desire for closure. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Mark arranged a covert meeting with his law school friend Peter at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of town. Together, Mark and Peter pored over the damning evidence he had gathered, legal documents, Eleanor's diary entries, and the private investigator's findings. They meticulously compiled everything into a cohesive dossier. As they sifted through the documents, Peter's sharp eye uncovered even more troubling details. Eleanor had engaged in dubious business dealings, forged financial statements, and forged partnerships with questionable figures, all in her relentless pursuit of rebuilding her empire. "Mark, this is enough to take her down," Peter said gravely. "But you have to tread carefully. If Eleanor realizes you're onto her, there's no telling how far she'll go to protect herself." Mark gave a solemn nod, his jaw tightening. "She's caused enough harm already. It's time someone put a stop to this." The following morning, Mark sat tensely in the grand sitting room, his bag resting at his feet, filled with the carefully organized evidence that could dismantle Eleanor's schemes. When Eleanor entered the room, her face as composed and unreadable as ever, Mark rose to his feet to meet her gaze. "Mark, we need to have a discussion," he began, his voice steady but filled with tension. Eleanor arched a perfectly groomed eyebrow, her tone clipped and dismissive. "Oh? And what matter could possibly be so pressing?" she asked, a hint of sarcasm lacing her words. Mark's voice took on an uncharacteristic firmness as he reached into his bag, pulling out the stack of documents. "I know everything, Eleanor," he said, his gaze unflinching. "About my father, about Harold, about the lengths you've gone to rebuild your fortune." For a moment, Eleanor's calm, collected mask cracked. Her sharp blue eyes darted toward the documents in his hand, betraying a flicker of unease. "You've been prying where you don't belong again, haven't you?" she said, her voice hardening. "Do you even comprehend what your father did to my family?" Mark took a bold step forward, his voice rising with conviction. "I understand that he wronged you, Eleanor. But what about the people you've destroyed along the way? What about me? I've done nothing to deserve this nightmare." Eleanor's jaw clenched tightly, her eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "And my family deserved to lose everything. Is that it? My husband deserved to die from the stress your father caused while your family thrived. Don't you dare lecture me about fairness, Mark." Mark's hands trembled as he raised the damning documents between them. "Revenge won't bring Harold back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It won't undo what happened. You've spent your life letting this consume you, hurting innocent people, destroying lives. When does it stop?" For a brief second, Eleanor's shoulders slumped, the unrelenting steel in her gaze softening. For the first time, Mark thought he saw a glimmer of regret flicker across her face. "Mark," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to an almost wistful tone. "You remind me of him, you know. Harold. That same fire, that same infuriating stubbornness. I never expected to feel anything for you, but here we are." Mark froze, her words catching him off guard. "If that's true," he said cautiously, "then let this go. Stop it all, Eleanor, before it's too late." Before she could reply, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel cut through the tension in the room, drawing both of their gazes toward the window. Moments later, the door swung open, and uniformed police officers entered the sitting room, their presence commanding. Peter followed closely behind, a look of quiet determination on his face. "Eleanor Brooks," one of the officers announced firmly, "we have a warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy." Eleanor's expression transformed, her face hardening into a mask of icy composure as she turned her gaze toward Mark. "You called them," she said flatly, her voice devoid of surprise but filled with quiet menace. Mark held her gaze, his voice calm but resolute. "You left me with no other choice, Eleanor." As the officers guided Eleanor out of the room, her gaze snapped back to Mark, her eyes narrowing with calculated intensity. "You might think you've won, Mark," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "But revenge doesn't fade so easily. Be careful it doesn't devour you the way it did me." Mark stood frozen, watching her disappear through the doorway. A conflicting wave of relief and sorrow swept over him, leaving him rooted in place. He had uncovered the truth and secured his freedom, but Eleanor's chilling parting words clung to him, refusing to let go. Was she right? He wondered. Would the shadow of their tangled history ever truly dissolve, or had it already left an indelible mark? Weeks later, the sharp crack of a gavel echoed in the courtroom, announcing the conclusion of Eleanor Brooks's trial. Mark sat in the back row, silent and contemplative, as he watched Eleanor, once so imposing and untouchable, stand before the judge to face the full weight of her actions. Despite everything that had transpired, Mark's testimony during the trial had been crucial in reducing her sentence. It wasn't sympathy that motivated him. It was a recognition of the shared complexity and the pain that had driven her actions. For the first time during the trial, Eleanor turned in her seat, her piercing gaze meeting Mark's across the room. The cold, calculating demeanor that had defined her was gone, replaced by an expression of quiet resignation. She inclined her head slightly, a faint, almost apologetic gesture that carried more weight than words. A few days after the trial, Mark received an unexpected summons to the estate, a place he thought he'd never set foot in again. The once overwhelming mansion now felt hollow, its grandeur reduced to an echo of its former self. Eleanor, in a surprising turn, had arranged for the estate's deed to be handed over to Mark as part of her final arrangements. The estate's lawyer extended a letter to Mark, its envelope adorned with Eleanor's unmistakable, elegant handwriting. The letter began, "It was never about wealth, Mark. It was always about closure. Harold deserved justice, but in my quest, I lost sight of what truly matters. You reminded me of something I had long forgotten, the strength it takes to move forward. This estate should no longer stand as a testament to my pain. Let it become something meaningful. Use it well." Mark made the decision to sell the estate without hesitation, its cold opulence holding no sentimental value for him. Its imposing grandeur had been a gilded prison, trapping both him and Eleanor in different ways. The proceeds from the sale erased his family's crushing debts, lifting the shadow of his father's legacy and providing his mother with long overdue peace. Using the remaining funds, Mark created the Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund, a gesture of reconciliation and a tribute to a man he never knew but now felt connected to. It served as a tribute to the man who had, without his knowledge, become a tragic victim of a bitter and destructive feud between two families. Returning to law school after everything felt like stepping back into a place of purpose and renewal. This time, his resolve burned brighter than ever. He was determined to use his legal education to make a tangible difference in the lives of others. Mark began interning at a local legal aid center, devoting himself to assisting people who, like Eleanor, had been left powerless by a system that failed them. On a cool and bright autumn afternoon, Mark received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was immediately familiar, elegant, and unmistakably Eleanor's. Sitting on a weathered park bench just outside campus, Mark carefully unfolded the neatly creased paper, his fingers trembling slightly in anticipation. Eleanor's letter read, "Mark, I've had ample time to reflect on everything that's happened. For so many years, I convinced myself that revenge was the balm I needed to mend the wounds left by Harold's death. But now I understand that revenge is nothing more than a prison, a cage we build for ourselves. Your kindness, Mark, even in the face of my countless mistakes, has taught me something I never thought I'd learn. Forgiveness isn't a weakness, as I once believed. It is, in fact, a profound strength. Thank you for choosing to rise above, for being better than the world of pain and bitterness I tried to drag you into. Thank you for proving that we are capable of breaking the destructive cycles we inherit from those who came before us. I sincerely hope that you find the happiness that eluded me in my pursuit of vengeance. Yours, Eleanor. Mark sat quietly, his eyes lingering on the letter as its heartfelt words seeped into his consciousness. Folding the letter with deliberate care, he slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket. For the first time in what felt like years, a strange sense of peace settled over him. A year after Eleanor's arrest, Mark stood on a modest stage before a group of eager scholarship recipients, their hopeful faces lighting up the small ceremony. Behind him, a polished brass plaque gleamed softly under the venue's warm lighting. The inscription on the plaque read, "The Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund for Second Chances." Mark addressed the room, his voice filled with passion and conviction. "This fund isn't just about providing financial assistance," he began, his words deliberate. "It's about giving opportunities to those who might otherwise be overlooked or left behind. It's about transforming pain into something meaningful, a purpose that can inspire and uplift." After the applause faded and the room cleared, Mark found a quiet corner to sit, lost in thought as the events of the past year played in his mind like a fragmented reel. Though his journey had taken unexpected and often painful turns, for the first time, Mark felt assured that he was heading toward the life he was meant to live. As he left the ceremony, a gentle smile graced his face, a testament to the lightness he now felt within. Looking up at the clear, bright sky, Mark felt the oppressive weight of his past begin to lift, replaced by a quiet optimism for the future. Tucked safely in his jacket, Eleanor's letter rested close to his heart, a quiet but constant reminder of the lessons they had both uncovered about redemption, justice, and the healing power of forgiveness. Thank you for coming along with us on this powerful journey, a story of resilience, redemption, and the enduring strength of forgiveness. Mark's story stands as a testament to the idea that even when confronted with betrayal and hardship, the choices we make can pave the way to healing and new beginnings. If this story resonated with you and inspired you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with the people you care about. Let's work together to spread the message of hope and the possibility of second chances to as many people as we can. If you haven't already, consider subscribing our channel for more heartfelt tales that touch the soul and remind us of the profound impact of compassion, forgiveness, and love. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time with another moving story from us. Until then, take care of yourselves and always remember to cherish the lessons life offers us along the way.